Okay, what the CAST rule allows us to determine is basically just determine the sign of the trig ratio. So what I mean by sign is whether your trig ratio in that quadrant is positive or negative. So this is the CAST rule. Quadrant 4 would represent C, 1 would represent A, quadrant 2 would represent S, and quadrant 3 would represent T. So CAST, thinking this represents all. So what that means is if I talk about this point in this coordinate, both my X and my Y values in this quadrant are going to be positive, which means my radius will also be positive, because using X squared plus Y squared, right? This is a positive and a positive. So thinking about my sign ratio, this would be a positive Y over a positive R. So this ends up to be a positive ratio. Cos would be a positive X over a positive R, which would end up to be a positive ratio. Tangent would also end up to be positive because I'm taking a positive Y over a positive X. So in the first quadrant, all three of my trig ratios have a positive ratio. In quadrant 2, if we can consider the second quadrant now, my X value now becomes negative, my Y value is positive, but when I use Pythagoras, whether I square a positive or a negative, my R value will still be a positive R. So when I consider my ratios again, my sign ratio in this quadrant would be a positive Y over a positive R. So my sign ratio ends up to be positive. My cosine ratio ends up to be a negative X over a positive R, which ends up to be a negative ratio. And my tangent ratio ends up to be a positive Y over a negative X, which ends up to be a negative ratio. So the only trig ratio in this quadrant that is positive is our sign ratio. So that's where S comes from. It tells you which ratio is positive. Everything else is negative. So moving on to our third quadrant. If this is our ratio, again our X value would be negative and our Y value would also be negative. Using Pythagoras, if I square a negative, I still get a positive R value here. So thinking about my ratios again, my sign ratio would be a negative Y over R, which would be a negative ratio. Our cosine ratio would be a negative X over R, which would be a negative ratio. And our tangent ratio would be a negative Y over a negative X, which ends up to be a positive ratio. So the only thing in this quadrant that is positive would be our tangent ratio. So that's where the T comes from. Lastly, we are to do this last angle. Our X value is positive here. Our Y value would be negative. Again, using Pythagoras, we will always end up with a positive R value. Thinking about our ratios, if we did our sign ratio, I would get a negative Y over a positive R, which gives us a negative ratio. Our cos ratio would be a positive X over a positive R, which is positive. And our tangent ratio would be a positive or a negative Y over a positive X, which would end up to be negative. So in this quadrant, the only thing that is positive is cos. So we can use the CAST rule to help us identify which quadrants have positive or negative ratios.